My father was running a little family vegetable and fruit stand at the time Pearl Harbor was attacked. I was going to high school, my brother was going to college, an older brother was also in the fruit stand business. I had a younger sister going to school, high school also. And my mother was like other Japanese mothers, working, struggling hard, supporting the family, keeping us fed and clothed. Wonderful, gentle woman. I think my parents protected us from knowing how really hard it was for us. I recall my mother working from morning to night, taking care of us, making our clothes from hand-me-downs. And actually, I thought our family was rather well off because my parents permitted me to take tap dance and ballet lessons, something that was quite a treat, and something that was rather unusual, I think, among Japanese families at the time. And so later on, when I found out we could barely make the rent, and yet my parents were permitting me to have these lessons, I felt very privileged and spoiled and grateful for my parents' consideration of my needs.
Tell me a little bit about your mother.
My mother was was so busy taking care of us that when she came over here from the old country, she actually never had time to learn the language. She was working from dawn to dusk, taking care of the house, of course, and sometimes going out to earn extra money to keep our family going. She was my father's second wife, and she herself had been married once before, and so I guess they both felt they were lucky to have hooked up with each other. You recall what it was like for a Japanese woman to have been, say, divorced in those days. It was forget a second marriage, you won't have a chance. But my father needed her after his wife died, and so it was a blessed union. They came from the prefecture called Kumamoto, which is on the southern island of Kyushu. They were both from the same prefecture. I don't really know what my father's family was doing. I know my mother's family had a tea farm, and she often spoke about working on the farm and growing and picking tea leaves. My mother was a very musical person, and perhaps that's why she encouraged me to take lessons, including piano lessons and dance lessons. She herself played the shamisen, the 3-string instrument that looked like a banjo, and also the koto, the 13-string instrument. I think my father also, although he was not musical, he appreciated and he loved it. He loved to have music in the house. I feel the rest of my brothers and sisters were also quite musical. I had an older sister who sang, played the piano, another sister played the piano, my older brother played the violin. So all of us were able to do something in the music line. When we bought the piano, I tell you, the house was so happy. Of course, my family was very Christian, so the first compositions played were always hymns, were the hymnals. I think that perhaps I should mention here, at the time that we were removed from our homes, we had to sell the piano for next to nothing. I think it was something like $10, including all the music. It was a heartbreaking experience for us. Yes, I had hoped to be actually a tap dancer. But I realized as I got a little older, I took lessons for about 6 years, but I realized I couldn't fulfill the image of for the American public of an American tap dancing star. I could never be Betty Grable with long, beautiful limbs, blonde hair, blue eyes. I think I kidded myself to think, well, if I'm good enough as a dancer, all those other physical attributes won't keep me back from becoming famous. But I think in the back of my head I knew that this was not the real world for me. My father ran a small vegetable fruit stand. Oh no, my father was definitely not a businessman, and he tried several different kinds of small businesses and always failed in them. I think I was told when I was real small, I never followed up on it because I didn't have that much communication with my father and mother, but my older sister told me that he once started a tofu factory. I think this was in Sacramento. Then I know that he did, and I have seen him, managing hotels, both in Sacramento, which we left in 1933, and in Los Angeles, where we moved to in 1933.
Where were you born?
Kathy's back.
Oh,
I was born in Sacramento, California, 70 years ago. Our family moved from Sacramento, where we were living, in 1933. It's part of the large movement of people during the Depression time. And my father wanted to try something new, so we all moved to Los Angeles. I went to grammar school, high school, junior high school, and high school in Los Angeles. And I was in my senior year when the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred. I happened to be at a party of my peers. We heard through the radio that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. We just couldn't believe it. The party broke up. When the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, I was at a party of my high school friends, and we were just shocked. It was hard to believe that this had happened. Of course, at that time, we didn't know how it would actually affect us, but we knew it would be affecting us in some way. The party broke up, we all went home, and I think our parents took it much harder because, as you know, perhaps a lot of people don't know, that persons of Japanese ancestry who were immigrants were not permitted to become American citizens at that time in 1942. This didn't change until 1952, 10 years later, when they were finally permitted to become American citizens. My father and mother had been here a number of years, but by law, they could not become naturalized citizens. So, of course, we were concerned as to what would happen to the immigrant parents who were considered aliens. And, of course, as soon as the war broke out, they were considered enemy aliens. If the immigrant was from either Japan, Italy, or Germany, he or she automatically became an enemy alien. We did not think, at least I didn't, and I think many of us who were second-generation Japanese, Nisei, didn't think much about what would be happening to us. We were concerned about our parents. We thought we were American citizens, therefore we were protected. We were protected by the Constitution to continue to have the freedom, the liberty that we, all Americans, have a right to. I didn't know directly what happened to many of the older Japanese men who were apparently picked up by FBI agents and immediately following the war, placed in jails. My father was not one of these who was picked up because he was not a community leader. He was not a teacher of Japanese language schools. He was not a Buddhist priest. He was a little small businessman. And so we were spared the shock that many families went through when their fathers were abruptly taken away from their homes and jailed, simply for being an enemy alien, not for any crimes that they had committed. So when we, yes.
This was a Sunday.
This was a Sunday, right.
And did you go back to school the next day?
We, as I recall, we did go back to school. Things had changed, though. I think our friends, non-Japanese friends, didn't really know how to treat us. I think they knew that we would be hurt if they ostracized us. On the other hand, just like our neighbors who lived around us, I believe that they felt if they were too friendly with us, they would be labeled Jap lovers. Therefore, our friends, our schoolmates, were caught in a little dilemma. I think there were those who didn't care what other Caucasians or blacks felt. They were friends and they remained friends and played with us. But on the whole, it became harder and harder for them to remain our friends. We were treated with sort of disdain. I think we were stigmatized simply because of our ethnicity. And I think that's one of the most painful experiences, the feelings about the entire wartime experience, that we were judged not on our own character as people and persons, but simply because of our ethnicity. Something that I think goes against the grain of the democracy, of the Constitution, and every right and privilege that we're supposed to enjoy as American citizens. It was very difficult to accept being non-Caucasian at the time. Yes, the curfew that the Army imposed upon us was, I forget the date of it, but I remember that we were not allowed to be outside of our homes after 8 o'clock at night or before 6 o'clock in the morning. And that curfew covered the territory. It was like 5 miles from our own home. If we had to leave beyond 5 miles, I believe we had to have a permit from the government, from the Army probably, that would permit us to be outside of our home area, which was beyond 5 miles. This curfew was also imposed upon German and Italian aliens. At the very beginning, I believe the government, especially, I would say the government, when I say government, I really mean the Army, was strict about this curfew, and they enforced it rather broadly. But as weeks went on, it was very apparent that the curfew was meant especially for those of Japanese ancestry. And the restrictions were slowly relaxed against non-Japanese aliens.
Do you remember when the order came down?
The order for us to be moved away from our home was signed by President Roosevelt and became effective on February 19th, 1942. The order actually said military commanders, of which there were a number, the Eastern Defense Command, Southern, Central, Western, the commanders are authorized to designate certain areas as military zones or prohibited zones from which they may exclude whomever they feel should be prohibited from their areas. It was a very broad, direct authority. That authority was, President Roosevelt gave that authority to the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, who then passed down this permission to prohibit, to set up military zone and prohibit any persons they thought should not be in those areas, transferred that authority to the individual command generals. And on the West Coast, it was a general whose name was John L. DeWitt, who took advantage of this authority and declared certain areas as prohibited and restricted areas. He was afraid, I believe, that he might get caught in the same kind of situation that General Short and Admiral Kimmel found themselves in after the attack on Pearl Harbor. As you know, they were court-martialed, and General DeWitt wanted to make sure he was going to be ready for any invasion by the Japanese forces. And so he went overboard to try to cover his flank and never to be put in the same position as those, the general and the admiral at Pearl Harbor. Most of us belong to community groups or churches, and the Army took advantage of those organizations to pass the word around. I believe it was in March of 1942 that mid-March, a little after mid-March, when the first exclusion order, which affected the Bainbridge Island people right off Seattle, Washington, they were the first group who were ordered to move. And I think they had about a week's notice to move. And I think that that city, as in other cities later, these notices to move were posted, tacked onto either telephone poles, put up at post offices, displayed at churches and community centers that existed, and that was the way most of us found out. We were all given orders. The head of the family was given an order to report to a certain location to get instructions on when that particular family would be expected to be out of the house, to be moved to a reception center or assembly center by the Army, which was run by the Army.
So tell me now about having to move. How long did you have, and what did you decide to take, and how did you dispose of things?
Oh, I was all of 17 years old, ready to graduate high school, madly in love with this young Nisei man, who lived on the other side of town, other side of Los Angeles. We were all frantic about where each one of us would be moving to. Los Angeles was a big area. It was divided into different sections. Certain areas were told they would be going somewhere. No name, but a certain section of inland. And therefore, since the Army did not notify each family exactly where they would be going, what kind of weather they would be encountering, or exactly when they would be moving, efforts within each family started to roll to get rid of, to sell, or to store their household goods, and then trying to separate out what they thought they would need and what they thought they could either store or sell. It was a hectic, frantic time for all the Japanese families. In our family, my father, as a matter of fact, destroyed all of his Japanese language books because rumors spread that if the FBI came to your home and found Japanese language books, your father or uncle or mother would be taken away. And fear just gripped the community over things like that. My father destroyed almost all of his Japanese language books, including a book that he had written. He had a number of copies of an autobiography my sister said he had written. Also, he had been carrying around the ashes of one of my sisters, a half-sister. And my mother told me many, many years later that he had buried those ashes in the backyard of our home in Los Angeles. She didn't know where, what part of the yard. I've often thought of going back to that house, but I didn't know how to approach the occupant of the house to ask if I could dig up his backyard to look for the ashes of my sister my father had buried 50 years ago. So I've never done it, but I've passed in front of the house a couple of times, wondered what could I do. I'm not sure, I think that he thought perhaps she was born in Japan, and I have a feeling he had hoped one day to take her ashes back to Japan. Either that, or he was waiting to get settled someplace in, say, Southern California, where he could feel, well, this is where we're going to set our roots, place our roots, and perhaps get a family plot and bury her there. But I have a feeling it was that he was planning to take her ashes back to Japan. Oh, all right. Many families owned their homes, so they had a lot more problems in terms of their economic situation and property. We were so poor, we didn't own the home, we were renting. So that was not as big a problem for us. Our problem was what to take, what to destroy, what to sell. And the neighbors, the persons, the non-Japanese who are not moving, being asked to move, knew that the shorter time we had to leave, the more willing we would be to lower our prices. So there were vultures all around, hanging around for days, waiting for the day that we would move, that we would literally have to give things away. My mother, of course, had some small items, beautiful little dishes from Japan, and I think some heirlooms that she decided to sell, brooches, obitome, things like that I know that she had to get rid of to sell because she felt we must take what is absolutely necessary as long as we were permitted to take only what we could carry at the time. And I have heard many stories of mothers who were so furious at the insulting prices that were offered by buyers that they rather than sell them at these prices, they would break the dishes or the big platters that they cherished so much. I believe those who left for the camps early on did not have the opportunity or the knowledge at the time or the permission by the government that they could store some things. That kind of information came later on, and those who moved into these Army-run assembly centers later on, say June, July, they were told that they could store some things. So many of those families were able to keep household goods, furniture, where those of us who left very early could not do that. I myself, yes.
At whose expense?
The furniture could be stored sometimes in Buddhist churches or community centers. The government itself offered in certain areas to store the furniture, but with a caveat. You store them at your own expense, at your own risk. And of course, as when many folks went back to that area later on, they found their homes and property vandalized, broken, stolen.
Aiko, let's go back to what happened in your high school. Tell me about a couple of incidents that happened there.
Okay. When I was going to high school, this was Los Angeles High School. We lived during that time in a very hostile environment, hostile to ethnic Japanese. There was a strong feeling of hostility against people of Japanese ancestry. Therefore, we had difficulties going and buying homes in certain areas, and this anti-Japanese feeling carried itself over into school. When the war broke out after Pearl Harbor, as a matter of fact, I think it was about a month after Pearl Harbor, I was reminded by one of my classmates a few years ago who came up to me and he said, "Don't you remember that principal so-and-so called us, we of Japanese ancestry who are ready to graduate that summer, called us into his office and said, 'All of you don't deserve to graduate. Your people bombed Pearl Harbor.'" We were in a state of shock. He said, "Don't you remember?" I think I pushed that in the back of my mind and just tried to forget it. He had never forgotten it. He was bitter all these years, this friend of mine. The Japanese American students tried their best to be the best citizens, worked 200% harder than everybody else because we were always under scrutiny, disliked, so we were out to prove that we were just as good, if not better, than the, quote, mainstream students. As a matter of fact, this young man, whose name was Shishino, he and I, we had known each other since grammar school days. We worked very hard to get good grades. We were able to reach the pinnacle of scholarly success for high school students by becoming members of the California Scholarship Federation, which was quite a thing at the time. And all of us worked very hard to be good students, to be good citizens. Therefore, after working for 12 years to reach the top of the mountain to graduate, after having lived through and in this hostile environment, then to have our high school principal talk to us like that was, in Hayao Shishino's mind, the most devastating experience of his life, and his bitterness carried him over with him all these years. I know that I was really disappointed and devastated to think that I wouldn't be able to graduate and wear a cap and gown with all my other Caucasian friends, and to be deprived of that diploma, which we worked so hard for, was a big blow to us. It was a proof that the feeling we had been carrying all the time, sort of a self-hatred for not being white, showed its ugly face and ugly head at that time. I think I may not be alone in saying that I grew up with a certain amount of self-hatred. I could never be Betty Grable. I hated not to be blonde. I hated not to enjoy the kind of attention that blondes got. And this school incident was another example of why we had the self-hatred, why it remained with us through our lives. Yes. Oh, fortunate, wonderful. Mr. Shishino took steps, although it was 40-something, almost 50 years afterwards. He wrote, after all those years, after those decades, he wrote to the Los Angeles Board of Education and complained about the treatment he and our 15 other members of our class received during the summer of 1942. And fortunately, there was a young Japanese American on the Board of Education at the time who took his complaint and his grievance seriously. He discussed the situation with other members of the Board of Education of Los Angeles and made arrangements to have a wonderful ceremony for those who still survived from the class of summer 1942 in Los Angeles High School, and had a wonderful ceremony in Los Angeles High School for those of us who are now grandparents and great-grandparents. And the funny part of this whole thing was that the member of the Board of Education whom Mr. Shishino contacted was my son-in-law. So when my son-in-law found out that I was a member of the class, of course, he made a special effort to make sure that this happened. And so we were presented our 1942 diplomas in 1989, I think it was. And that seemed to have set a trend, because I know that after that, other cities up and down the West Coast did the same thing. And even UC Berkeley, I think 2 years ago, had a ceremony and UCLA, ceremony to honor those who would have gotten their degrees or who were dishonored during that time, and the school wanted to make up for it. So it turned out to be a lot of fun for those of us who are now grandparents to be receiving our high school diplomas.
So what happened?
Yes. Okay. I think we were talking about how we decided what kind of clothes to take. What did we do about our personal property? Since we were not told exactly where we would go, it was hard to decide, do we take summer clothes, winter clothes, sneakers, boots, or what? So I found what few things I selected were totally inadequate for the kind of weather that we finally did encounter when we went into camp. At the time, I mentioned to you a little while ago that I was engaged to a young Nisei who lived on the other side of town. We found out that the persons living in the area where he lived would be going to a particular assembly center, whereas my family would be going somewhere else. And so, foolishly and desperately in love, we eloped, so I could go with his family. That is what I did. So I ended up in a camp called Manzanar, where my parents did not move for another month or a month and a half. They did not go to the same camp. They went to another camp called Santa Anita. It was a horse racetrack, and it was a pretty miserable situation in which they found themselves. Not that the Manzanar camp was much better, but it was at least not horse stables.
And how'd your family take this?
My family was distressed. I was such a spoiled brat, and I just did whatever I wanted to. My father pretty much disowned me for a while. He wouldn't contact me. I only wrote a couple of letters. And I say my life in camp was pretty miserable because I knew I did such a dishonorable thing, and it haunted me all the time I lived in camp. that I had disgraced my family by my behavior. Then I was too busy in camp. Here I was, 17 years old, and a year later, I became a mother in camp. I had my first child in camp. So busy learning how to be a mother when I hadn't yet grown up myself. So, and then thinking about my poor parents. Oh, I did wrong. The camp life, all in all, with everything else so wrong, it was a miserable experience for me.
And when you got to Manzanar, how did you get there?
We first boarded a train in Los Angeles, went north, and we came off the train, and buses were there to take us to this desolate desert area, to this camp called Manzanar, which was still being built, actually, an area between the towns of Independence and Lone Pine in the eastern half, sort of north, not too far from the border of Nevada, in Northern California. The day we arrived was hot, dusty. When we got off the bus, we lined up, were told which barrack we should go to leave our suitcases, then told to go to a certain area where we were issued a sack, long sack which served as the mattress cover, told to fill it with hay, which was served as our mattress for the period that we were in the camps. It was devastating. Manzanar was, of course, a desert, and all around us were sage brushes. There were mountains way, way beyond east and west of that area. There was no way that anybody would even want to escape from the place because the nearest place was so darn far away. And besides, if you're Asian and you escape, you can't melt into the crowd. I mean, it's ridiculous for anybody to think they could escape and go undetected. The area was known for, what do they call? Dust storms, where it looked like a tornado. It was shaped like an upside-down cone. We were besieged by these dust storms day after day after day. The summers were desperately hot, and winters were quite cold. The those persons who were ill, the people who were senior citizens, and mothers with little infants, these persons were the ones who suffered the most because of the unavailability of water in the barracks, the unavailability of food immediate, which was of such importance. That's right. They didn't tell us where we were going or for how long. Yes, as I got off the bus, I could not believe that people were going to live in a place like that. I'd never seen a desert before, and there was no civilization. It was just barren, sagebrush-filled area, and it was so depressing. I think the parents, the Issei, were happy to be there simply because at least they were together with their family and they weren't separated from their children. And I must say, many of the Issei had some free time for the first time. They didn't have to worry about getting up at the crack of dawn, farming or running stores, and they did have some free time, but I think they also lost their liberty, which to me was one of the biggest deprivations that we suffered those 3-4 years loss of liberty was something I felt very, very strongly. When we first were assigned to barracks, I was sharing a room. There were 7 of us. The room size, I believe, was 16 by 20 feet. There were 3 different families. My brother-in-law, his newlywed, and his wife, newlywed, our sister-in-law, her husband, and a small child, little girl, and my husband, and I. So there were 7 of us in this room 16 by 20. We separated our living quarters by putting up slats and putting blankets or sheets. I think it was blankets, GI issued blankets to give us a little privacy. That's the second thing, privacy. We just didn't know what it meant anymore. These barracks were built so quickly and with poor quality wood where the wood shrank, and the tar paper was slapped onto it quickly. So the walls between each apartment, and there were 4 or 5 apartments to each barrack, the walls between each apartment did not go all the way to the ceiling. So if somebody sneezed in apartment 1, you could hear it in apartment 5. If you snored loudly, it could be heard, which now it stands to reason that if something like that carried, conversations were never private because you could hear everything. The lack of privacy did a lot of damage at the camps, I think. You had to go outside if you wanted to carry on a confidential, private conversation. Well, yes, it was some honeymoon. I don't know how the others felt. I know how I felt, that I had never had any sexual experience before I went to camp. And so making love on a straw hay mattress was noisy. I mean, every time you moved a toe, crackle, 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 you know. I don't know how I lived through it, or perhaps we just respected each other's need for togetherness and sexual activity, that we ignored it. But I couldn't ignore it very easily. It was difficult, very difficult to have a honeymoon under those situations, under that condition. But I managed to have a child, and 1 year afterwards, unfortunately, not a very healthy child, due to the lack of nutritious food, a lack of milk during my pregnancy, as well as for my child after she was born.
What was the food there?
At first, it was just dreadful. It became better after the residents learned to, after the residents had cultivated the land and started growing the vegetables. But it was, I guess it was supposed to be like army fare, but I think it was less nutritious. I'm sure it was. It was boring. And when you have to cook for so many people, I don't think you can ever expect real delicious food unless you go to a fancy restaurant. Now, this was a situation in which each camp prided itself, is that right, English, on how little they spent for each resident. They would report back to the government in Washington, we only spent 49 cents per person in our camp. Some camps would be bragging they only spent 35 cents. So you could tell the quality of the food was not good just by that the price virtue alone. And of course there were a lot of problems with people stealing from the mess halls. All right. First, my pregnancy. Since I was young, it was pretty easy, 9 months gestation. It would have been easier if we had not had to have our meals, 3 meals outside of our own apartment. Our own apartment finally served as bedroom, living room, and of course the main things we lacked, kitchen and bathroom facilities. So 3 meals a day, we had to get in line for food. And being pregnant and suffering what most pregnant women go through, what is known as morning sickness and nauseous periods. Waiting in line for our meals during that period was very, very difficult under the conditions that existed there, the dust storms, the heat, the cold. Then when, I think the lack of real good milk at the time, which was considered very important for pregnant women to have, that I think affected my fetus, the embryo, a great deal. When my child was born in the camp hospital, she was born with an allergy to the powdered milk that they permitted babies to have during that time. And it was not diagnosed that she had an allergy to this powdered milk, and that she should have what was called at the time carnation milk in a can. I requested that for my child, but they said no, that has to go to the Army, to the men in the armed forces, and we would not be permitted to unless we could afford to send for it from outside. And of course we couldn't do that. We were earning minimum salaries, which ran from $12 a month, $16 a month, and $19 a month at that time. $19 for the professional, $16 for semi-skilled, for skilled, and $12 for the unskilled laborers. We could not afford to buy canned milk. So my daughter suffered tremendously. She was hospitalized in the camp, went in and out with stomach disorders because of her inability to get this milk, which was, of course, the lifeline for infants at the time. Most children double their weight, most infants double their weight, birth weight, at 6 months. My child had not doubled her weight in a year. She was so sick. Very angry. I was very angry. I felt so responsible for my child. There's nothing at all that I could do about it. And I think the lack of this important nutrition at this time of her life has affected her whole entire life. She didn't have the basic ingredients to be a healthy person. Oh, the hospital, very sort of primitive. The doctors were mostly Japanese American doctors. The white Caucasian doctors served as supervisors, overseers. The nurses and the doctors were primarily Japanese, and they were skillful. I'm sure, although I didn't know anything about hospital and supplies at the time, but I have read what Japanese doctors who served in the camps said, that they lacked medicine, they lacked the proper equipment to do the necessary work that they needed to do as doctors. I think we were probably very low down on the totem pole in terms of priority as far as the government was concerned at the time. Yes, that's right. Isn't it funny? I didn't think too much about it. Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward's were two large stores that probably made a whole lot of money on the Japanese camp residents. we read those two catalogs from the two companies like Bibles. I think I remembered memorizing what page the chocolate candies were on in the Sears Roebuck catalog, what page the diapers were on, or all those necessary things were in the Montgomery Ward catalog. We bought diapers. During those days, there were no Pampers or Huggies. We bought diapers through the catalog, baby clothes, layettes. Of course, it was something. I remember going through these books and thinking, well, this costs $3. We only get $16. How much of that? What do we have left for the rest of the month? Fortunately, we didn't have to pay rent or buy our meals, but everything still cost the same for us as for people who lived outside of the camps, and they were making $100 a week, or maybe not that much, $100 a month, as opposed to what we were making, $16 a month. It wasn't easy. I remember being pregnant and saying, oh, I've got to have this box of chocolate, and order it, wait for 2 or 3 weeks, anticipating every day a box of chocolate, and then a notice coming saying, sorry, we're out of stock. I remember crying and crying when that happened. I was talking about the diapers. Right. The latrines, the men's latrine, the women's latrine, and the laundry room, those 3 different structures were built between rows of living quarters, barracks. We mothers, especially young mothers, knew we want to wash our diapers in real hot water, so we'd have to get up very early in the morning before the hot water supply would run out. We'd get up very early, do our laundry, and of course there was no washing machine then. We had a washboard and some very rough soap that looked like lye or whatever that is. Big soap, washing, rinsing, and drying on the clothesline. No sooner than when we had hung our diapers, we would hear somebody yelling, here comes the dust. Here comes a dust storm. We'd rush and take these diapers, 36 diapers usually for me every day, and try to get them off the line before the dust storm came, oftentimes successfully, sometimes not. When we were not successful in beating the dust storm, there we were again, back in the laundry room, washing all of this again. And it wasn't just diapers, of course, it was all the other clothes, the sheets, everything was done by hand. I think nowadays, I'm so pleased for young mothers who have the Pampers and diapers, Pampers and Huggies, disposable, easy to take care of, so that they have more time to be with their children. I think that's a real blessing, and I hope young mothers will appreciate the progress that we've made in this country. Yes, having a child in the camp was certainly a very interesting, traumatic experience. It is, having a child anywhere is. But when you don't have running waters and you have diapers, I tell you, it's something else. Having running water is something I appreciate to this day because I was deprived of it during those 3 years in camp. I think one never realizes how important it is to have a little faucet. When you have a child and the child has to use diapers 6, 8, 10, 12 times a day, you have to change the child, you understand how important it is to have running water, to swish out the soiled diapers, and then be able to wash them right away for use, immediate use later. And in the camp, since we had no running water, it was not easy. Every time I changed the child's diaper, I had to run outside to another building to rinse it out, bring it back again, and stack them up so that the next morning I could wash all those 36 diapers. The lack of water also was very important in homes, in apartments like my mother's. My mother was very ill, so was my father, and so ill that they actually had to use bedpans. Now imagine not having running water when you have a house, an apartment, with somebody who is ill who requires the use of a bedpan. You have to keep running back and forth from another building in order to rinse out bedpans. These day-to-day, the deprivation of the niceties of life was something that most of us who had to go through that don't forget.